Hello everyone, today I am looking at Shenmue. This is a very funny, interesting game, just from the history alone. For those of you who may not know, the amount of money that Sega shoveled into this game at the time was so much that it basically bankrupted almost their company or their ideas for any further consoles in the market. So, this was the last game on, I want to say it's the Dreamcast or the Sega Saturn. I forget which one. But basically, the CEO and everyone just prioritized this game so much that this is the game that really sank the company. So this was going to be their masterpiece. And so it's really interesting to see, what was this game that they had to make, that it was going to be the greatest game ever made. And after playing it, I can kind of understand what they were going for. This is the most quote-unquote realistic game in terms of a kind of simulator without being a simulator. It's supposed to really be a real life. However, it has a classic kind of kung fu revenge story happening in the background. So the basic premise is you play as a young man, Ryo, and your father is basically killed in his dojo by a man named Long Di. And so they both know martial arts, but of course Long Di is using some kind of forbidden art, kills your father, and steals the dragon sword, which is kind of an heirloom that your family has been guarding for centuries. And basically you have to avenge your father, find this man, and get it back. What's very interesting about this game is that it treats it like it's a real life simulation. And in fact, the first hour of playing this game, for me, is the most distinct thing I've ever felt, from this game, while all the hours of the rest of this game just didn't feel as impactful as that first hour. What I really enjoyed is the fact that if you held down L1 or whatever, you were able to zoom in, and it was so intuitive and interesting because whatever Ryo was looking at, it would actually start to give a description of it and zoom and have text and dialogue. And I just thought, oh, that's so smart because I'm zooming in, I'm looking at something, therefore I'm going to get a description of it. And it's something so stupidly simple that I actually don't know why it's incorporated into other games. Like, what if in Ocarina, when you went into first person mode, that's how you would get enemy information or read signs or something, instead of just pressing the A button? It's a lot easier, but here it actually makes more sense, and it's just kind of mind-blowing to me. So it's so fascinating. Again, this game, it almost reminds me of like a David Cage game like Detroit Become Human, where it's more not open world but hub world, and essentially you go around your neighborhood and you're able to talk to characters. They all have their night day cycles. They all have their little things like a Majora's Mask, where they're going here and there, and you can have different dialogue with different characters, and no matter what, the days will always progress, and there will always be a time limit on what you're doing. What's really interesting too is that this game takes place in sort of December, and so what's very fascinating is in the first half of the game, it's just a normal kind of small Japanese village in the mountainside, and in the other half of the game, suddenly everything becomes Christmas themed, and you have these fake, like Santa Claus figures outside the convenience stores. And it's just so interesting to see the culture just suddenly change, because that's actually how it happens. And other things like when you're looking at maps and you zoom in, all the text for where you have to go and all the places is, again, very intuitive. And it's very easy to read maps for once in a video game. But yeah, this is really supposed to be a real simulation game. And what I love about the fact is that it inherently isn't, because of technical limitations. And I think the most distinct thing about Shenmue is actually the voices. I guess they just had so much dialogue in this game in order to cut down on the actual cost of recording or the file size. A lot of the voices have compression on them, and in a weird way, they actually make them sound way more distinct to this game. It kind of sounds like almost everyone's talking through a walkie-talkie almost, but you don't really mind it. At first, it's extremely jarring, and it sounds like you're playing some low-quality piece of crap thing, but as you get used to it, it kind of becomes strangely extremely endearing. And again, you know, as the game starts, when you start your search for your father, it's not like you have this gigantic, like, you know, waypoint and revelation and the plot picks up. It's like, no, you have to spend time literally just going around your local town and asking about, you know, Landee. That man was, you know, wearing an oriental vest. It looks like, you know, he was like on a boat somewhere, and like you have to go find some sailors, and it's all these little like things that feel so realistic, where, you know, again, the interactivity of the game itself, you know, is like a game, and it tries to create all these little mini games and all these little things you can do. And this is very similar to what other games at the same time, like Ocarina, were doing, where you have all these mini games which make up the sum, which are all these parts which make up a greater sum than what it really is. And so Rio, you know, armed with his martial arts, kind of goes up against the world and becomes like an investigator, detective / revenge person. And so while probably 90% of this game is just talking to people and walking around the town and enjoying the ambience of this, you know, fake / real world, about 10% of the game is actually combat. And it's funny that when it actually happens, you kind of go into this 1v1, you know, classic 2D style fighting game thing like Tekken, where you have to fight your opponent, and the combat is really good, but there's just not a lot of it, shockingly. Like, it's like very rarely do you ever get into a fight, and when you do, you kind of like need to relearn the moves because it's been so long. Despite all that, you actually learn new moves from different characters depending if you fulfill their side quests, like the Reggae Man and the you know, other, I think the Chinese businessman. They teaches you like some like special kick or something, and so you put all of these things together, and you're finally able to create this really interesting mix of all these different moves. And like when you hit someone, it has a huge impact, and the sound effects are great, and the rumble is great. Like the combat in Shenmue, even though it's like less than 10% of the game, is honestly really good, and probably one of the better parts of the game. I mean, the whole thing's an experience, but it was just really interesting to see that. Again, there's a, you know, you have this chapter also where you have to find this hidden thing in your wall and find this hidden crypt below your family's house, where you find the other medallion, the dragon medallion, and basically you use these two things to basically, you know, apparently when they're combined, they have the ultimate power. So armed with one of the medallions, you pursue Landee. It's very interesting what this game feels like, because the plot is honestly so methodically slow that there's so many different things to do. It feels like, you know, if you're living a normal life, you could completely forget about the plot and just like do mini games in the game world. Something that was, speaking of which, one of my favorite ones was actually the gacha machine, simply because it had a lot of characters from Sega's other franchises like Sonic, and it was so funny to see those characters in real life as actual toys. And I think that is the word that I would use, is slow and methodical, because there's so many like little things that you have to do. I mean, aside from almost going to the bathroom and eating, you kind of deal with every other thing life has to throw at you. You know, the sun goes down. Something I forgot to mention, you have to make it home before midnight, or else the game will force you, and then your mother will worry and all this other stuff. You know, you can save in your room and whatever. But yeah, like the attention to detail, the amount of things that you can do and focus on and interact with, you know, is a lot. It feels like this whole world has been built for you to interact with. Of course, the funny thing I love about Rio is that most of his conversations end with "I see," and that's kind of just his line that people know him for. And his character is interesting. He's like vengeful, and he's wants revenge and justice for his father, obviously. But it's super interesting that he's also just like, he really is like an 18-year-old kid. He really doesn't know what he's doing. And so there's times when he's also very unsure of himself and can get like easily tricked by older people. And it's just very funny to me. But yeah, this entire game feels more like a book than an actual video game, just from the pacing of it. The fact that only so much or so little really happens in the game, but it's still very interesting. And so by the end of the game, you basically, after all these things that have happened, you basically only get to go on a boat to get to Hong Kong to pursue Lan Di. So you don't even meet Lan Di again in this game. You don't get to meet Shenmue, who is like the main like love interest character in this game. None of this stuff actually happens. In fact, Shenmue only appears at the very end of Shenmue 2 along with Lan Di, who you just see briefly and you barely miss. And I think I might as well review Shenmue 2 in this same video, because that's a game I really did not enjoy playing, honestly. I didn't finish it because it was too much. And that's the thing. The pacing of these games is so slow and so methodical that it just takes forever for anything to get done. Again, it starts off so well and so quickly with Lan Di murdering your father as a very distinct character motivation to continue, but it just ends up kind of drying up in terms of pacing. And suddenly you're doing all these other things, like looking for other people or other places or other things, and then trying to buy a ticket yourself to Hong Kong, and like you buy a cheap ticket and get ripped off by this fake travel agency, and then you want to do revenge on the travel agency, and it feels like Lan Di at killing your father isn't even important anymore. You completely forget about that whole story. It's really crazy. Like, so much meaningless, useless, distracting stuff happens that honestly I don't really mind. I just thought it was really funny that this was all going on. Another thing I just have to mention, like the amount of detail in this game. Like, you can turn on and off light switches. You can interact with almost everything in your house, or you can at least examine it. And so that kind of detail, the fact that you're living in a real fake world, and the ambience in the start of the game is such a weird mood, and I just love it. It's like this cognitive thing where you're portraying a real world, but it's fake, and it's the knowingness that it's fake that makes it surreal. And I don't know, it's really, really cool as a experience. Again, this game was kind of coming out in the early days of when video games were coming quote unquote realistic, and so this whole project was very ambitious. It tried to make a game that really simulated real life while also having a good story in it. Again, though, because the story starts off so strong, it kind of teases out and stretches out the Lan Di revenge story so long and so thin, it just gets almost ridiculous. But I can understand why. Like, when I saw Shenmue 3 announced at E3 in 2016 or 15 or something, I saw people get so crazy hyped for it. I just never understood why, and I do understand why. That it's this long-running revenge story where you get very intimate with the main character, really feel like Rio and who he is and how he is, and you really begin to appreciate just in general the story around his character. And it feels so personal because it takes so much time to develop. And so again, it's very personal, I think, which is why people are so excited about it. But at the same time, it's been teased and like brought out so long that it's just kind of like at this point ridiculous. And like, there are other parts of this game that are problematic in the sense that like you need to start your day like coming out of your room every single time in the same way. You have to wait for Rio to like step down the stairs, put on his shoes. It's like you're literally doing a morning routine. You're literally living your life as this, Japanese martial artist high school boy. And he also has like this girlfriend who's like leaving for Canada, and he's like, oh, that's fine, I need to focus on like getting revenge for my father. Again, they're just so compact in terms of storytelling. It's just so interesting to me, but at the same time, it's, you know, not the most fun experience in the world. Of course, something I should have mentioned. I know I mentioned there was, 10% combat. Really, honestly, it's like almost like 2% combat. But I would say like 20% of this game, or another 10% of this game rather, is also like QTEs. I think this is maybe the first game that did quick time events. I know God of War definitely made them super popular, unfortunately, and then Resident Evil 4. But this game is the one I can like first remember that really made QTEs a big thing, and so that'll happen a lot in the game. Even times when you're getting into fights, you can just do QTEs and there won't even be a fight, and it is just kind of like, oh, okay, all right. But there's one thing I do need to talk about this game, which is, I was talking about how, it has a slow, methodical, this really good start, this slow, methodical pacing out, stretching out, which is really cool because you can explore the world and do whatever. And the thing is, your mom will give you allowance every morning. It's like roughly 10,000 yen, and you can use that money to spend on whatever you want, but you're not in school and you can just roam around the town. What I really dislike and I really hate is halfway through the game, Rio is like running short on cash, and so he decides to get a part-time job as a forklift operator. And I was pretty much kind of enjoying my time up until this point. It was getting a little bit tedious with how many times things were like, kind of resetting each day, kind of felt the same. It felt like Londi had completely, Rio kind of completely lost sight of him. He was long gone. We were doing all these weird, extra stupid chores and side quests for all these neighbors. It feels like the main story was in the dirt. And I was kind of getting tedious with it, but I was like, I'm still going to stick with this. But then, regardless of what you do, Rio has to get a job. And like I said, he gets a job as a forklift operator by the docks because that's the last place where Landy was sighted, because of course he took a ship to Hong Kong. So you're trying to get into contact with the gang that works around the docks in order to find out where he goes. But you also need a part-time job and pretend like you actually work at that job and take care of it. So the problem is now that when you wake up, you automatically cannot roam around the town. Like, the town is basically cut halfway, so all the little interactions in everyone's days and all the things you could observe and like interact with are just gone, and you are stuck doing a minimum wage job that feels like a minimum wage job. It is awful, it is terrible, it is just abysmally, it sucks, it's so bad. And so like every morning they have this thing where it's a little mini game where you drive this forklift, and you basically have to drive this forklift in a race as like a fun thing. And of course, if you get first place, you get this little prize or whatever. And you gain the respect of your co-workers down by the dock. But that whole arc of the game was so boring because you have to do that race every single morning, and then for like your shift, you actually have to pick up boxes from around the docks and put them in different warehouses. And so you'll go up to the box, find out which warehouse it's supposed to go to, and remember which warehouse it is. And they're not like laid out in a very weird way, like you'll have 18, 19, 20, and then 21 will be like on the other side of the place, and then 22 and 23 will be right beside each other logically. So it's like a real warehouse like working shift. So like that's what I hate. And you have to, and like it takes a long time. It takes like a real time shift of the day. So like in game time, you're spending all the time you would going around the town investigating. You're instead using it to like do all this, like this one mini game over and over and over again. And it kind of gets really boring, and it feels like the main story has completely been lost, and you feel like honestly terrible because it feels like nothing is happening, and nothing is happening. You're just doing a part-time job, and the main story is dead in the water, and it's so frustrating. It's so weird because that's what like having a minimum wage job is like. It sucks. But yeah. I was just unprepared for the fact that Shenmue is actually a forklift operator simulator rather than a martial art revenge story. It's ridiculous, honestly. And there is a point where I've hit this point sometimes with other games where I just thought to myself, I am not enjoying myself. Like, I really want to stop playing this game. And so I got to a certain point in the story where, again, like back in the day, I can imagine people just dropping the game once they hit this point because it is so tedious and so repetitive and boring and bad. And you have to do it like so many times. And I thought to myself, should I just stop playing? Should I just give up? And I really hate dropping games unless they're stupidly hard like F-Zero or Ninja Gaiden. But in this case, it was like a game where this is like one of the classic games. And I thought to myself, you know what, I'm not enjoying myself. But if I force myself through it, I'm going to at least know the full experience of this very famous game. It was honestly like reading a work of old literature. Like, it's very difficult right now, but if I just force myself through it, I can at least say I finished it. And I have to tell you, I am so glad I did that, because I don't think the ending justifies fully the experience. I mean, it is a good, interesting ending, but it's still very kind of underwhelming in certain ways. You know, essentially Ryu gets involved in this gang thing. I think, you know, his girlfriend gets kidnapped or something. And so basically you have this big climax where finally the forklift thing ends, and you basically have this climax where you fight like with this wave of like 50 guys, you know, at the harbor. You know, they fight the whole gang. You find out Lan Di took a ship across the harbor to Hong Kong. And you also save your girl, and you let her ride on the back of your motorcycle and drive her home to safety. And I don't know, the motorcycle scene, it reminded me a lot of FF7. I don't know if it's like an intentional thing, but I don't know, maybe motorcycles were just really cool in this time frame. But that segment was just really, really cool and really fun, and it kind of felt like, oh, Shenmue is like back. We're playing the game again, and now we're not playing Forklift Simulator 1999 anymore. But yeah, it was nice. It was fun. And then again, once the game ends, it's like you have this whole emotional recap of the fact that I'm really leaving the shores of my homeland of Japan, and we're really going on this quest to a foreign land to pursue the killer of my father. And it's just this, it's very emotional at the end. And again, it's so bizarre to me that the game is so long and so little story development happens, and I'm kind of okay with that to a certain point. If it didn't have the whole forklift thing, this game would be much better. But yeah, I can see though why, you know, people are so adamant about this game. It's just such a traditional kind of like revenge story and romance, and like there's something about that feels classical. You know, there's nothing but Ryo and his mission to become a real defender of his family's honor. Like it's something that's very, very distinct, I suppose. But again, you know, you play this whole game, and by the end of it, all you've accomplished is getting on a boat to go to the point where the bad guy is. Like, that would be like the first 2 chapters of any other video game is what this entire game is, which to me is just insane. And of course, you know, it was really more so, the gameplay was more so based around, you know, the fact we're making a simulation of real life, a more intense and direct version of it. And in this scenario and in this case, you know, that's just not enough and not feasible to really justify a product like this. And it's really sad to see what happened to it. Again, the story itself is not super amazing. Again, it's a revenge story, but it's I suppose it's very well written. Which brings us briefly to Shenmue 2. So Shenmue 2 is interesting. Obviously, you're in this huge city of Hong Kong, and so it picks up right where the last game left off. You notice that the compression on the voices is less iconic than it used to be, and so, despite all that, there's like a million other NPCs and characters because you are in the city and has a bunch of distinct districts and stuff. And it's just very busy, very noisy, and I just don't really like the fact that, well, I was considering playing it until you got to the first part and you like rent out this apartment and you meet this biker chick called Joy. And she's a cool character and whatever. And she's kind of like, this femme fatale kind of character. But essentially what happens is Ryo is instructed that in order to find out what happened to, Lan Di and where he is, there's like 4 like people of the 4 quadrants of the city you have to help. And so each one of these people are going to have like a quest for you. And I just got to this point where I'm not enjoying this aesthetic. I don't want to like treat this thing like another, like long ass novel. I want to just like kind of get this thing over with and be done with. And so I just like, I'm not doing this thing where it's telling me I'm going to do like 4 weird missions for these people. It's going to take a million hours to do in like this Hong Kong city, which is just, again, the aesthetic and the environment is very important in this game. I feel like this small town in the Japanese countryside was much more cozy and much more interesting to explore. While the giant city of Hong Kong, even though technically impressive, really did not appeal to me and stuff like that. But as I know, what happens near the end of the game is it's pretty cool where Lan Di is essentially hiding out in Kowloon City along with other criminals, and you basically track him down and just catch a glimpse of him before he escapes via helicopter. And you basically go down this river and finally meet Shenmue, who is like the main character. Like the girl on the main cover of the game does not show up until like the very end of the second game. And you finally come to this temple in the Chinese countryside where, the medallion is being used in this ceremony. So again, like the pacing of this game, this would be like chapter 4 in any other game, but it's been stretched out so much to the point where, after Shenmue 2, they couldn't make one again. And Shenmue 3 was basically crowdfunded, and it was a complete disaster, kind of. Shenmue 3 obviously had new graphics, a new setting, it was very modernized, and people started complaining a lot about the dated mechanics that, Shenmue introduced. The fact you can, like, look at something and zoom in and, appreciate an object is no longer a technical feat. It's not impressive. And so all of these very tedious things that were in the original Shenmue games that were in Shenmue 3 really started poking out and becoming these nuisances that people had tolerated in the past because of the technical limitations, but they hadn't innovated. And so there's this whole weird idea that you think, if this is what they're capable of now, think about how this thing will grow and innovate and turn into a game where all these things really change. And the problem is that to change all of those aspects of the game, of Shenmue, it would become a completely different game. It would become something more like Assassin's Creed or something. Because all of these things are just like not as fluid and not possible. And because the code base is based around this very methodical style of gameplay, to innovate it would be to completely reorganize and reframe the entire game itself. And so it's kind of like a weird, sad place where Shenmue is in now, where like the game itself that was super dragged out and doesn't know how to even like forget about ending its story but continuing its story. It doesn't even the gameplay doesn't justify the story anymore, and it's really sad. I think I read something recently that even by the end of Shenmue 3 it only still covers like 40% of the story, which is just insane. It's like if they keep making Shenmue games, it'll take them like a century to finish like the first story, if you will. And I just find this like insanely funny. But yeah, after Shenmue 3, it was kind of crowdfunded and it had a slightly like mediocre reception. And unfortunately, it looks like it's not going to get another sequel after that. It's really unfortunate, but I think, I was thinking about this, that there's a certain amount of time for you to release and innovate something. And I was looking at animated films, video games, I mean, God knows, like Half-Life 3. I found that like after 10 years, after a decade, you kind of know they can't make the game that you want, and or in another case or scenario, the game that they want to make has already been made by someone else, and their innovation like has been out innovated and obsoleted by some other party, and now the franchise is like left out to dry and is transformed into something else. And I guess just on that note, what also prompted me to make this now is that there was this really strange thing that I saw called Shenmue City. So apparently there were two things. There was a Shenmue mobile game, but more interesting, there was another game called Shenmue Online. And so in the mid-2000s, it was actually planned to have a Shenmue MMO. And the trailer for this thing is insane because you basically have Joy, or some girl, being captured by the triads or the Yakuza or whoever on top of this building, and Ryo is basically outnumbered by all these agents, and he's backed up by all these other fighters, and with all of their distinct, costumes and designs and everything. And it looks kind of cool, kind of hype, but apparently the project never actually launched. It just kind of was an idea and had, art and concept and whatever, but it just never happened. I don't know, the idea of a Shenmue MMO is kind of hilarious to me because it's such a distinct, single player solemn experience, and it's like, no, we're going massive multiplayer and everyone's going to be Shenmue now. I don't know, the whole thing just sounded so ridiculous to me. But it was a project at some time, and I find that to be really, really interesting. Again, my impression on Shenmue is I think it really works almost better as a demo. The first hour of the game I really enjoyed in itself, and I felt like anything after that was kind of stale gameplay. It's kind of like, the thing just keeps going and going and going, and doesn't really have any story to really justify it. But the first hour of playing the game, if it was a demo, I think it's perfect in a certain way. It's like a simulation of this fake real world, and I really enjoyed it in those first few moments. But again, then it kind of gets into the point of okay, when are we actually going to get Land D? Why do I have to do all these chores and these other things and effing forklifting? It's so dumb. It's so frustrating. And but yeah, I still love Shenmue as an idea, though, as a concept, and as this very special thing and this vision of something that they wanted to create that never really came to fruition. But yeah, this is a very, very interesting title, and I hope, you shouldn't I would say this, you don't have to play all of Shenmue to really appreciate it, but you should at least experience the demo of Shenmue or the first hour or something like that, just so you can understand what they were trying to create and why this game was so insanely expensive to create that almost bankrupt the entire company. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much all I have to say on Shenmue right now. I don't know what the future of the series is going to look like. I did try out Shenmue 3 and did not get very far because, again, it was very janky, as I said, but I guess I hope that they make something out of this series, and if not, it's a very interesting piece of industry history. Anyway, guys, that's it. Take care.